Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the BIA's webinar on the UK's leadership in antimicrobial resistance. And this is an event marking 2022's World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. Great to see so many attendees. I think that the tick is still going north, but it looks as if the majority of folks have joined now. I'm Deborah O'Neill. I'm a member of the Bioindustry Association Board, and on behalf of the BIA, I sit on the AMR Industry Alliance Board, and I'm also a director of the BEAM Alliance. In my day job, I'm the founder and CEO of Novabiotics, a company developing novel immune-based solutions to life-threatening and life-limiting diseases, including those associated with bacterial, fungal and viral infections. So we're here, it's all about AMR. Data published earlier this year informed us that antimicrobial resistance was associated with almost 5 million deaths globally and directly responsible for 1.3 million deaths in 2019. Since then, we know the situation's got even worse, and we have data also confirming that the COVID pandemic and the use of antibiotics throughout has exacerbated the problem and worsened the crisis. And AMR is a global health emergency, but one that the UK is absolutely committed to tackling through national and global leadership in policy, stewardship, and reimbursement around antimicrobials. And the innovation in therapies and diagnostics to tackle AMR by UK-based biotechs is all part of that and what the UK is doing and its leadership. And not forgetting that some UK-based pharma actually manufacture some essential antimicrobial therapies in the UK. So it's been a significant year for the UK's activities in continuing to drive international collaboration and economic models to combat AMR, not least the pilot subscription model for antimicrobials being launched. A lot of Innovate UK-led activity, including inward and outward-facing international missions, funding from the Wellcome Trust into CARBEX and opening the next round of grant calls, and also welcomes continued support for GARD-P. This evening, LifeArc are launching a funding call into chronic respiratory infections as well. And that's just some of the highlights of what's been going on this year. And we're going to hear more on a few of those points from our fantastic panel. And please note that there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the session. I'm looking forward to a good discussion there. So to introduce our speakers very briefly, it's a pleasure to welcome Lizzie Molyneux. Lizzie is mum to Isaac, who is a 17-year-old young man living with cystic fibrosis, and Isaac's in the 10% of patients for whom modulator therapies do not work, so he's fully reliant on life-saving antibiotics. We were going to have not just one, but two patient representatives today, but unfortunately, Candice King can't be with us, and we send her our very best wishes because she's currently poorly. Candice is another cystic fibrosis patient and actually works for the Cystic Fibrosis Trust. So she's a 28-year-old fabulous advocate, and I'm sure we'll hear from Candice at other events in the future. We're also joined by Nick Crabb today. Nick joined NICE in 2010 and currently oversees their science policy and research program. And Nick was the NICE lead on a collaborative project with NHS England to develop and test the innovative models for evaluation and purchase of antimicrobials. And it's been a big year on that front. Phil Packer is with us today. Phil joined Innovate UK in September 2017 and leads on the AMR and vaccines program there. And that includes overseeing projects funded through Innovate UK funding mechanisms such as Biomedical Catalyst. And last but absolutely no means least, we have James Anderson. And James joined the IFPMA as Executive Director of Global Health in January 2021. Formerly was at GSK, where he was Head of Corporate Government Affairs. And as of last week, James is now also the chair of the AMR Industry Alliance. So really looking forward to hearing from our amazing panel. AMR, however, begins and ends with patients, and that's why all of us in this field do what we do for the individuals who need antimicrobials to survive and thrive. And so it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Lizzie as our first speaker to set the scene for today's event by providing the patient perspective. So Lizzie, over to you, please.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for the introduction as well. As Deborah said, I am Lizzie. I'm mum to a 17-year-old Isaac who suffers from cystic fibrosis, which affects all of his organs, but particularly his lungs and his digestive system, clogging them with very sticky mucus. Isaac was 3 weeks old when he was diagnosed, and our antibiotic journey started right from that day one with constant oral antibiotics, which he has never ended. We were told that his life expectancy without antibiotics would be less than 3 years old, and that we'd need to treat his chest infections in particular very aggressively throughout his life with antibiotics to protect his pink and tiny little lungs. Isaac suffered from a lot of respiratory infections and was considered colonized with Pseudomonas aeruginosa from about 18 months. And that's when we started on nebulized antibiotics as well, which he takes prophylactically along with the oral antibiotics. And again, that's never gone away. He does up to 6 nebulizers a day alongside those oral antibiotics. What we find typically happens when a CF exacerbation begins is his symptoms increase. We visit our CF team and we might try an extra oral antibiotic to try and curb the infection before it gets any worse. Continue with our nebulizers, we might add in other nebulizers as well. We increase his chest physio, but typically we end up on IV antibiotics. I have been trained to deliver those for him, administer them at home, which is fantastic and means his quality of life is a little better and we're not spending quite so much time in hospital. But when Isaac was 13, he came down with a number of infections at the same time, along with a fungus, and he ended up in intensive care, reliant on oxygen, and had to learn how to walk and breathe that oxygen again some weeks later. At that point, his veins were no longer viable for constant PICC lines and cannulas, and he had a portacath implanted in his chest so that we could deliver those antibiotics more easily. So for us, the delivery method is a very important part of antibiotics. We tend to give the CF team a lot of sputum, which they grow in the lab, and we can understand what he's culturing at any given time. And so we can then understand the infections that he's growing and their sensitivities to different antibiotics. So we're almost always waiting for lab results to better understand what's happening in his lungs. And we need a huge range of antibiotics to treat all those infections. And we often mix and match those antibiotics, swap them around to try and trick the bacteria and eradicate, or at least reduce the amount of infection that he lives with in his lungs. As Deborah said, Isaac is in the 10% of CF patients who unfortunately are not eligible for CFTR modulators, which have made a huge difference in the cystic fibrosis community for the better. Unfortunately, Isaac doesn't produce any of the CFTR protein, and so he needs a very different type of fix. So we are wholly reliant on antibiotics. They're his life jacket, sort of keeping him afloat until we find a treatment that corrects the underlying cause of his disease, or if we should reach end stage CF, then ultimately lung transplant may be an option for us. Antibiotics keep Isaac well enough to enjoy a certain quality of life, and that would diminish rapidly should AMR become more prevalent in our lives. I understand and read about it being a global issue, and for families like ours, it is a constant worry. All that said, Isaac is a happy 17-year-old. He's very stoic and brave and wonderful, and in some senses has never known life without CF. But it does impact him greatly, and his sisters and the family as a whole. And we're very grateful to live in a time and in a country where we have access to these drugs that we're so wholly reliant on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. That was great, and that set the scene fantastically in terms of why we're all here, why we do what we do. As you put it perfectly, it's a global problem, but it's very much every day of Isaac and the family's life. So thank you very much. And just a reminder for anyone who has questions for Lizzie and the other panelists, do pop them into the Q&A stream and we will pick those up later. So thank you again, Lizzie. And now my pleasure to hand you over to Nick Crabb from NICE. Over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So many thanks for the invitation to participate in this webinar this afternoon. I wanted to talk about the sort of pilot projects that NICE, in collaboration with NHS England, have completed to develop and test innovative models for the evaluation and purchase of antimicrobials. Now, the background to this is that the pipeline of new antimicrobials in development really isn't sufficient to meet global public health needs from the threat of antimicrobial resistance. So our work aimed to encourage increasing investment in antimicrobials by firstly evaluating antimicrobials in a way that reflects their full value to the NHS, and then by paying for that value in subscription-style contracts where payments are delinked from the volumes used in clinical practice. And the intention there is that can support really good stewardship and no sort of unnecessary overuse of the products. So in terms of what we did, the project was formally launched in July 2019 by Steve Powis, the medical director of the NHS, and Sir Andrew Dillon, who at the time was NICE's chief executive. We launched a procurement exercise in June 2020 to select the 2 products that would then be the subjects of the pilots. Through that process, ceftazidime with avibactam and cefiderocol were selected for the pilots, and that decision was announced in December 2020. We then underwent sort of very, very detailed evaluation of the products by NICE and the partner organisations working with NICE, and we issued sort of formal NICE guidance in April 2022, so April this year. And then the project concluded with the sort of final implementation of the subscription-style contracts in July 2022. So as Deborah said in her introduction, this was a big year for the subscription models and the work that both NICE and NHS England have been doing in this area. Now, one of the major challenges was estimating the full value of the antimicrobials. Most medicines mainly impact the patients directly treated, and the sort of health technology assessment frameworks that we use at NICE and other jurisdictions across the world use are well sort of equipped for evaluating such products. But antimicrobials, because of antimicrobial resistance, have broader attributes of value, broader public health value. And just to give you some examples, that might be by preventing transmission, or it could be enabling treatments or operations that require the availability of effective antimicrobials. Now, recognizing the complexity of evaluating antimicrobials, the Department of Health engaged its Economic Evaluation Policy Research Unit, which we tend to refer to as EPRU, to develop a framework for the evaluation of antimicrobials that took account of these broader elements of value. That work was published in 2018, and it was subsequently used by EPRU to estimate the value of ceftazidime with avibactam and cefiderocol in the pilot projects. So we work very, very closely with EPRU in this work. As well as developing a framework, a special framework for these evaluations, another reflection of the complexity was that we established a special NICE committee for these evaluations. And this committee combined sort of expertise in infectious diseases and AMR, together with experts versed in NICE's sort of evaluation frameworks. This special committee, taking account of the EPRU reports as really key inputs, estimated the value of the antimicrobials, and they estimated the value in units of quality adjusted life years. And it was those values that were used in the final commercial discussions between the NHS and the companies, which I'm really pleased to say led to the implementation of the subscription contracts on the 1st of July this year. Now, obviously, really important milestone, and we were very, very pleased with the outcome and the successful conclusion of those subscription contracts. But of course, having subscription contracts in England for 2 antibiotics doesn't solve a huge sort of global problem. So now the pilots have been completed, NICE and NHS England are working together on the routine arrangements for the evaluation and purchase of antimicrobials. We had a series of lesson learned engagements based on everything we understood from the pilots. We involved key stakeholders, and that feedback will very much inform the sort of routine arrangements. And we will also be engaging with key stakeholders further over the coming months. We're also hoping that the sort of arrangements moving forward from here will be at a UK-wide basis, and we've had enthusiastic noises from the devolved administrations so far. But recognising that AMR is a global problem and that sort of activities in England or the UK alone are not going to solve such a problem, we're also liaising very closely with other countries on pull incentives, so that together we stimulate increased investment in antimicrobials. And we're working very closely with our sort of AMR team in DHSC, who are sort of taking some of these things forward through discussions in the G7 and G20, as well as through a whole series of discussions bilaterally with interested jurisdictions. I'll stop there, Deborah, but very happy to take questions later on.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was great. I mean, obviously a massive amount of work for yourself and the whole team involved, and it's just great now that it's eyes forward on the future. And as you say, the impact of this pilot, although it seems an understatement for the impact that it can have and what the future now holds. So yeah, no doubt there'll be some questions later. Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you.
And my pleasure to hand over to Phil Packer at this stage. So if you're ready, over to you, please, Phil.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for asking me to speak today. So I work, as Deborah said, I work for Innovate UK, and I look after AMR and vaccines. And as you well aware, our aim really is to try and increase the economy by building businesses in the UK. And by doing that in this particular area, we're also going to improve the health of the UK and globally in the long term. So as mentioned, we've fund things through the biomedical catalyst and our SMART call. And I'll just quickly pick up on what we've done there. But what I'm really going to talk to you about in a few moments is a bit that we've been doing, looking at more collaboration globally. And I think we all heard already this is a global problem, and I think we are going to need global solutions, and it will be benefit to all of us if we work closely with our partners across the world to try and make the best solutions work rapidly. So just to let you know what we've done in the past, we've funded over £56.5 million worth of work in the field of AMR over the years. And that's not just on the human side and not just human therapeutics and diagnostics, but we do take a One Health approach, and we fund work for agricultural farming as well, looking at remedies and solutions in that area, as well as things like infection prevention and control as well. And we'll continue to do that. And at the moment, we've still got, we've got about £8.5 million worth of programs, projects running, nearly 20 projects running, and that will continue. But we are also looking for some more direct work on AMR in the future. Now, I can't say anything yet because nothing has been finalised and things change. There's no commitment, but we are looking to invest some specific AMR funding in the coming years. And again, what we'll be trying to do there is to help businesses help them to develop their products coming out from early academia and into small companies, and helping them develop their projects through the early stages of preclinical, particularly preclinical development, and sometimes into the clinic. So that's where we are and where we're going. But I said we were going to talk. I was going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing globally. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about an inward mission we had this year, where we invited delegates from abroad. We had up to 15 delegates from across the world who came to the UK, and we had 3 events, one at Oxford at Harwell, one at Alderley Park, and one up in Edinburgh, where we brought these delegates to meet a group of AMR interested people from industry particularly, and we had some talks, but we had a large networking session, and this was pre-planned. And so this went really, really well, because we understand we've got to get people to work together, and this is where the solutions will come. And we had 113 participants over these 3 centres from 11 different nations. And we had over 166 completed meetings between the delegates at various points within that week. And we have got some really good feedback at that event, and it has helped companies considerably. And to the extent that we are now planning to do that, a similar event on an annual basis. So I think that's good news. And we've also, this year, we went to the US on a mission to try and understand what is going on in the US in AMR in a little bit more depth, where their strengths and weaknesses are, and where there are the potential to have some collaborations in the long term, whether that means taking businesses out to meet businesses directly, or setting up some sort of incubator there, or having a dual call with the US, different parts of the US government to fund particular areas of research. And that report will be is coming out very shortly, and it has there is a draft version, and that'll be made public soon, and it will highlight all the different areas of potential collaboration that we spotted, and potential areas of joint working, and some of the strengths and weaknesses in both nations. And I won't go into great detail about that, but it was very successful. We found some key areas in diagnostics and therapeutics, areas like phage and the microbiome, which might be worth looking at together. And also we did notice that particularly we had more of a forward look in the animal and farming sector and the agri sector, and probably had more information and more knowledge in that area. And that is something that we might build upon and do something with the US. But all that is to be decided, but that was very successful. But in my final minute or so, I'd just like to do a bit of an advertisement, if that's possible. So before COVID, if we remember that far back, we had a mission to Germany where we had a look at whether we should work with Germany on antimicrobial resistance. And that went really well. And as a result, after COVID, we've now decided to do some more work in that area where it's called a GBIT, which is a global GBIT, Global Business Innovation Program, which is run for us by Innovate Edge. And what we'll do there is we'll take some people, some companies over to Germany, and we will introduce them to companies of like-minded, like-mindedness, who they might want to collaborate and talk to. And also we will support these companies over the year by giving them input into their business plans and organizations. And as part of the trip to Germany, we will also be taking the delegates who go, we'll probably be about 12 different delegates. We'll be taking them to the annual AMR conference in Basel as well. Now that call to take part in that mission is still live, and it is still live until the beginning of December, and you can find more details on the internet. So if you'd like to be involved in that, please come up, please have a look. We'll particularly be looking at diagnostics, therapeutics and vaccines on that mission, as far as I understand, but depending on who applies, we might slightly modify it. So I think going forward, Innovate UK is really interested in developing the AMR space. We're looking at putting more funding into it, but we appreciate that this is not an area we can solve ourselves. We need to work across government, and we are doing that, and we need to work internationally where we can as well. So that's all I was going to say, Deborah, but if anybody would like to ask more questions, I will try and answer them later on. Thank you.
I think you've already got one waiting, Phil, so yes.
Okay, I'll look at that and try and answer it now or in the later. Yep.
That was brilliant. And it's safe to say, yeah, you don't get a break next year looking ahead from a very busy year. So, but that's really good to know all the activity that's going on. And I think, you know, for all the participants, just the commitment in this area that through Phil and the wider team, Innovate UK, UKRI and Department of Health and Social Care actually have. So that's great to know. Okay, so last but absolutely no means least, bringing certainly an international flavour and no doubt joining us from somewhere outside of the UK, it's my pleasure to welcome James Anderson. Hi, James, good to see you.
Hi, Deborah. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. So I'm the Executive Director of Global Health at the IFPMA, which is the International Trade Association for the Biopharmaceutical Industry. I'm also the chair of the AMR Industry Alliance, which is an even broader coalition of private sector companies that work together to advance the key elements of combating AMR. So within the alliance, there are not only R&D companies, big ones as well as smaller biotechs, but also diagnostics companies and generics manufacturers. Because of course, the industry does have a critical role to play and recognizes that very much in terms of researching and developing new antibiotics to treat resistance as it increases and emerges in different parts of the world, which we are seeing happening, unfortunately. But also to make sure that those antibiotics, both the newer ones and the current ones that may be off patent, are available and used appropriately, again, in all parts of the world. It's not just a problem in higher income countries such as the UK. And finally, we do need to make sure that antibiotics are manufactured responsibly. When that doesn't happen, antibiotics can leak or even be discharged out of factories, often into local waterways. And of course, the bacteria that are present in those environments are exposed to that antibiotic and can also develop resistance. So all in all, the industry is active on all four of those major areas. But I wanted to focus in, given the the comments made by the other panelists really on the critical need to ensure that the research and development and the investment to support that is happening, because we always will need a pipeline of new antibiotics that are innovative, that work in different ways to the older ones, because those are the ones that will be able to avoid and therefore treat the resistance that is, as I said, is increasing in many parts of the world. And so, as has already been said, we currently aren't we don't have a robust pipeline. When you look at the antibiotics in development across the whole industry, there are really only a handful in phase 3. I think it's 8 on the current count, and not all of those will finish, will be approved and will become available for use. And those are the antibiotics that could be launched in the next 2, 3, even 4 years. And that's a small number. That's what's concerning to many people. Even earlier in the pipeline, in phase 2 or phase 1, kind of working backwards, you're still looking at only tens of products, whereas I think most experts agree we should be setting our sights much higher to make sure that we will be able to continue treating infections of all different sorts, whether it's in patients such as Isaac that we heard about before, or somebody who falls over and gets a cut on their knee that becomes infected, or indeed someone going into surgery in hospital, all of whom can need to be able to rely on robust antibacterial capabilities. So what the industry did a couple of years ago was to recognize this gap and recognize the urgency to try and do something about it. So we brought together about 25 of the major pharmaceutical companies, together with the Wellcome Trust and the European Investment Bank, and advised also by the WHO, into a big public-private partnership to raise just over $1 billion for investment into that pipeline. Because the problem is, for the main investors into R&D, which are typically the public markets and venture capitalists and big companies, aren't investing enough money into antibiotic R&D when they can choose, and the other areas are getting the investment. And so we launched the AMR Action Fund, and it has already invested into 2 innovative small companies, biotech companies, that do have innovative products. And those products are, if they are successful, will be used to offer new treatment opportunities for the priority pathogens as listed by the WHO. The goal is to deliver between up to 4 new antibiotics over the next decade, and hopefully faster. But this is expensive, it is difficult, many of them will fail, and that's why $1 billion, while it's a lot of money, it's still only a bridging point, really, because what we definitely need in parallel are the new economic models globally that that Nick talked about in terms of what has been launched in the UK, which I must say is really a groundbreaking move by the UK government and NICE and the NHSE. And when I sit in Geneva and talk to the global companies and we look around the world, I'd make a couple of further observations. First of all, the G7 has made a set of statements over the last few years indicating they recognize the importance to correct this economic model, and that they are committed to doing so, but not all of those G7 countries have taken concrete steps. Some have, and there is progress being made. In the US, for example, there's a very interesting piece of legislation called Pasteur that is tabled into Congress, and with luck, we're all hoping that it will get enough support to be passed even in the next few weeks or so before the end of the year. That would make a very big difference. It has quite a lot of similarities to what has been done already in the UK, and as Nick said, we agree it's really important that what the lessons that are being learned here in the UK and the experiences are shared with other countries. They won't all end up in the same place, but if it can help accelerate what they're trying to do, then so much really the better for all of us. Secondly, I would highlight the European Commission in Brussels, which also is looking quite actively at what they can do. Clearly, the structure of healthcare across Europe is different to either to the UK or the US, and so they are looking to a different type of model to achieve a similar goal that could benefit all the countries in Europe. And then I would highlight as well both Canada and Japan, where there are early discussions of also doing a pilot program like in the UK. Again, with some similarities, but no doubt certain differences as well. What we need as companies is that when you add up all of these things, all of these incentives, they get to the kind of amount of economics that really will attract the investment that we need to make into the R&D. We feel that we're moving in the right track, but it's very slow. And in the meantime, there is a risk that patients may find that they don't have the products they need, and that companies, particularly the smaller ones, may actually run out of money. We've seen a number of antibiotic biotech companies going bankrupt or being sold at sort of fire sale prices. So in summary, it's really important that we continue to make the progress that we're making in the UK. The UK is leading the way on this and has done for a number of years. That's recognized and really, really valued as a contribution to the world. Secondly, the industry is fully aligned with the work that's going on and absolutely committed to playing its part and wants to be part of the solution. That's why the two companies that stepped up and participated in the UK pilot also should be congratulated for, making that bit of a leap of faith. And then thirdly, when we come back into the UK perspective, as Nick said, the next steps moving from a pilot with 2 products to a broader rollout for a larger number of antibiotics and across the whole of the UK, which can build on what we learned in the pilot and make it even better, will also be a very important step. So in summary, we hope that if we are successful in getting these number of different programs implemented around the world, that will make a very significant difference to the pipeline and to the investment into new antibiotics for patients like Isaac in the future. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks so much, James. That was great, and congratulations again on wearing another hat. I'm sure you probably don't sleep now. It was great to see you in your first meeting as chair, albeit virtually, of the AMR Industry Alliance, which the BIA, as one of the kind of membership organisations, gets to sit on the board of. So again, I think showing that the BIA is very committed to keeping up with what's happening at a global industry level. So thank you very much, James. Okay, so we have a few questions already in. which is great, but Chair's prerogative. I think I have an opener again, I think, just to give us some perspective, and one for Lizzie, if I may. I'd just like to know, and if you're okay to share this, I suppose a numbers question in terms of antibiotics for Isaac. How many different antibiotics would you say? I mean, he's 17 now. It's an estimate. He's actually had during his life, and I suppose, you know, when you've had to change because of resistance and them not working anymore. So do you have a number?
I would say it's definitely in the dozens, less so in terms of nebulized drugs, but more so in, I'm sure we've tried every type of oral antibiotic. The IV drugs, he's just transferred into adult care at Papworth University Hospital, and they are trying him on some new things to try and sort of trick the bugs or treat them in a different way. So we're very grateful to have that arsenal of different options to try. They obviously try and hold some back for more serious illnesses, so that he doesn't, the bugs don't develop that resistance, but he's on them, oral antibiotics, nebulized antibiotics every day since he was a small baby, and IV antibiotics probably about 6 to 8 times a year, each for a 2-week course. So I'm very grateful to be able to administer those at home on the most part if he's well enough. Otherwise, that's, you know, a considerable amount of time in hospital.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's quality of life, you know, when he should be out and about, if he does have exacerbations and needs those IVs. So yeah, hopefully, as you say, in the future, better therapies and you know, another modulator therapy or some option that means you can turn the dial down on those.
Yeah.
So much for that, Lizzie. Definitely why we're all here doing what we do.
Thank you all.
So we have a question for all panelists, and a thanks from one of the participants as well as I'm sure for all of them. So this is the entire panel, and it's thoughts on the role of real world data on advancing our understanding of the health and economic impact of AMR, not just in the UK, but globally, and the role of real world data on informing the development of antimicrobials that meet current and future needs. So that's open to anyone who'd like to kick us off and share their thoughts on that real world data as it relates to AMR and usefulness.
Shall I start?
Yes, please, Nick. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a really nice example of the use of real world data in the sort of the work that NICE did was actually the work of our sort of partners in the Economic Evaluation Policy Research Unit of the DHSC, where they actually based their evaluation primarily on sort of real world susceptibility data. And one of the reasons for that is that antibiotics are often developed using sort of non-inferiority clinical trials, and for very good reasons. It's, you know, that there are good ethical reasons for doing that. But what it can mean is that the clinical trials result in sort of, you know, really important information on the sort of safety and efficacy of the antibiotic as an antibiotic, but without necessarily saying a great deal about the sort of intended population. And that type of information comes much more from the sort of in vitro data. And I think one of the problems the HTA community has had with antibiotics in the past is applying its standard frameworks. And, you know, a standard framework with an inferiority trial, you know, doesn't demonstrate the superiority, whereas the in vitro data can actually be much more important. So I think that's a, you know, that's a really good example, I think, of you know, being flexible and using the best available data, even if it is non sort of trial data. I think more generally, you know, the sort of the data infrastructure for collecting sort of information on antimicrobials. I think that's going to be very, very important moving forwards. But I think real world evidence, as well as trial evidence, has got a really important role to play. And I think the key take home is that evidence is important. And somehow or other, there does need to be evidence that these things work and that, the value that they bring.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nick. And James or any other of the panelists, any thoughts?
So I'd add a couple of points, not particularly technical, but one is simply that the way that cases of resistance are captured by healthcare systems is actually not very good. And so the starting point for data on burden of disease actually is already kind of a problem. So an example would be something like a quarter of oncology patients who actually die of an infection, and yet what's recorded on the death certificate is oncology, right? Yeah. So that's kind of an example of a bit of the challenge. Now, as Nick said, and the second point, I was going to totally agree with Nick that clinical trials of antibiotics are by then the nature of the area quite limited. They're often pretty short duration because it's curative by and large, but also because of the need to structure them in a non-inferiority way. And so the sort of those two to illustrate what Nick said, that there are real gaps in the data. Real world data is a very powerful, sort of set of data that often comes from a range of alternative sources, let's say, versus those very standard ones that can help fill in the gap in some of the gaps in some cases. But I would just, and again, Nick said this, it's not a silver bullet, I would say, in almost any case that I'm aware of. So bottom line, and slightly long-winded, it is useful. And there are really important gaps here. So it's even more useful, I'd say, in antibiotics than in some other areas. But we shouldn't view it as a sort of what would you call it? A silver bullet.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Some of the great points.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up, if you've got time, I was going to say exactly the same as James, but I think also data, and it's not quite what you're saying, but I think data from patients, and I think telling us what they want as well, I think that is important, and we mustn't lose sight of things that have happened which might change what we need to do next. So things do change. So you look at the MRSA instance in the UK, we've dealt with that by practice in hospitals rather than necessarily with drugs. So maybe we need to think, we've not solved the problem, but we've considerably reduced the problem there. So we need to think somewhere else in the antibiotics. Where is there more urgent need? So I think we have to be continually looking at what's happened.
Absolutely. So be prepared to evolve as the landscape is as well. Absolutely. Thanks, Phil. Okay, you're still on, I'm afraid, Phil. A couple of questions, I think, for you. We have some bio-entrepreneurs obviously joining us. Couple of folks working in spin-outs that have, in one case, a molecule with antiviral activity, which leads us on to another question that's coming up. And another participant has a program focused on TB and non-tuberculosis mycobacteria. So broad question, but where can they look for support, funding initiatives, etc.?
So I would say in the short to medium term, the best place to apply is the biomedical catalyst within Innovate UK. So you have to be a business lead on that. The reason I say that is because that money is allocated to health and life sciences. So I'm not saying you've got a better chance of getting funding, but it's a health call. There is also the SMART call, which you equally can apply for, and that So for people who are not just doing human stuff, SMART goes into the agri side, but SMART Call also does batteries, anti-gravity machines, all those sorts of things. So it's a wider remit. So the best target is the biomedical catalyst, and that goes about 3 or 4 times a year, as does SMART, and it's on a cycling program. So just keep an eye open for those.
Brilliant, thanks, Phil. And a question for Nick, although I think jointly Nick and James may have answered this, but it's just around which countries / jurisdictions, I can't even say it, which other countries and territories you have collaborated with, please. And I'm guessing this is on pull incentives and the subscription model in particular.
I'll go first. I'm sure James can add to it. So yes, so I mean the level of interactions is varied a lot. So perhaps the jurisdiction where I've had most input has been in Canada, where I was appointed to an advisory panel working on the sort of pull incentives. But there's been sort of interaction at all sorts of levels with many countries. So the USA, we've been had several discussions there. Sweden, Norway, Japan. There's been input to various G7 and G20 discussions. Germany, Singapore, and then we're sort of involved in TAFTA, which is the Transatlantic Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance. So there's been lots of interactions, but some have been deeper than others. James.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add here is not a direct answer, but Nick's being very modest here. So what the UK has done is do something completely different, and that's why all countries are really interested in learning from it. But it's exactly what we need and what we need other countries to try as well, right? Because if we don't do something different in terms of the economics and the procurement models, it's difficult to see how the economics can work and how we will attract that greater investment. So, and Nick's played such a strong role throughout this for many years. Personally, we should all be thanking him and the colleagues in the NHS and the rest of NICE and elsewhere. But I must say I'm not surprised that you're in demand, Nick, because this is really new. It's never been done before. It's not easy at all, and it will need to be adapted to fit, let's say, with the systems and the other ways of buying medicines that take place in each of the other countries. But from my point of view, the kind of the principles and the approach that has been done here now successfully is really is leading the way and showing the other countries, hopefully, the sorts of things that actually could lead to success here.
Brilliant, thanks very much both. So great question, one close to my heart that's come in for everyone. And it's interesting that Lizzie mentioned Isaac had issues with fungal infections as well, but of an attendee who said, we've talked mainly about bacterial infections and resistance. What about fungal and viral infection and resistance? Is there a similar problem? And a similar problem with the medicines pipeline and needing better incentives. So that's open to anyone. And I guess the short answer is yes.
Yes. Innovate UK haven't got any specific funding for fungal problems. We know it's a big problem, so it's just the same as everything else has to come through at the moment through SMART and the BMC if you want to apply for that for money in there. But it has been noted by the funders that we haven't got much work going on in this area, and we need to address it. But we have to have the applications to do that in the first place. So.
And I would just add again, fully in agreement. The WHO recently published for the first time a list of priority fungal pathogens, which is a really useful analysis, because that gives a set of targets that they believe pose the most risk to patients around the world, fungal targets, and those are of course the ones that then all researchers in BIA companies, in big companies, and in academic research institutions, should be focused on, right? Because certainly we've seen it picked up a little bit more in the US media, but there have been a few outbreaks of really, really quite severe fungal infections, particularly in patients that are that might have another that are vulnerable in some way due to a weakened immune system or a comorbidity. And so again, yeah, the answer is yes. It hasn't had quite the focus that I would say bacteria have, but when we did the AMR Action Fund, that does actually have it does cover both. So it is looking at funding. The focus is on bacteria, but if there are fungal antifungals that are in the pipeline, then they will also be considered for funding.
Thanks, James. And somebody's asked, where can they get the list? I mean, that only came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's available via the WHO website if anyone wants to have a look at that. And it's been shared on a few organizations' social media channels as well. So final question, we have a few minutes left. A great point around the role of diagnostics as well as therapies in this space, and should the focus be as much on the kind of diagnostic side as the therapy side as a solution to AMR? And again, I think the short answer is yes, but I'd love the panel's take on this.
Yeah, I would say yes. And there is, I think Jim O'Neill made the point that really should you be giving an antibiotic until you've diagnosed what you've got, and I have a tendency to agree with that. So I think there is an importance in diagnostics. Again, we fund quite a few diagnostics programs, and there is the Longitude program, which is coming to an end soon. So it is important, and I think part of the issue there is some good diagnostic technology out there, is actually getting it into the health care system is something that we need to now concentrate on, because there are some good technologies out there.
Great, thanks, Phil. And yeah, I know it's a big focus of Innovate UK. It is another key jigsaw piece in the AMR puzzle. We still have a couple of minutes left. We have a follow-up question to the real world data one previously. I don't think there's a short answer to this, but can the panelists please share, and thanks to your responses on the real world data question, can the panelists please share what they believe needs to happen to enable the development and production of novel effective antimicrobials, particularly for the treatment of multi-drug resistance gram-negative bacteria? So I guess if we have this as the final question before we wrap up and say thank you, what would be the one thing in terms of what needs to happen, the enabler? What would you all say we need to get those effective treatments for MDR gram-negs? And James, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we've sort of talked about it. So you definitely, the support from Innovate UK, and I would mention Carbex as well as another really important public funder that does get money from the UK government, but also the US government and the Wellcome Trust and a few others that fund the early stage research. That's kind of the essential first bit. And I would say there are some increased sources, as you've heard. for good research. But then the gap has been more what happens when you get into the bigger clinical trials, where the amounts of funding each company needs are bigger, and that's where the gap is. That's why the AMR Action Fund has focused there. So that would be my sort of short answer to that. Not very specific, but it's consistent with with what we've been saying so far. And clearly, in order to complete the circle and make it self-sustaining, that's where we need the incentives and the economic models that Nick was talking about.
Absolutely, thanks, James. So, Nick, apart from cloning yourself, any what would be the?
I don't think the world needs that.
I don't know.
No, I very much agree with James. I think I think we already have some quite good sort of push incentives. I think it's great that the AMR Action Fund is occupying that sort of almost intermediate space. But I think these pull incentives are really important. So my number one wish in the short term, because I think it's big enough to make an impact almost on its own, is the PASTA Act in the US. I think if that happens, that will be a huge step forwards in sort of mending the broken market in antimicrobials. And then, of course, the sort of work that we're doing and work that I know Europe's more broadly looking at this now at EU level. And I think eventually they'll all come together, but it needs a really big break in the short term. And I think the most likely one is the PASTA Act.
Brilliant. So we've had push and pull incentives depending on stage of development of these much needed new therapies. Phil, anything from your good self on this?
No, I agree with that. I think what we are particularly interested in is making sure that we can try and support the very early companies, early stage, to make sure they get things right or get the right support early on, so that they're more likely then to get the larger funding from CARB-X in the future. And that's our thinking. To go off on a complete tangent, I think one of the big things that we need to do is public awareness still. And I think people don't understand what AMR is still in the wider community, and the need for these new antibiotics and the reason for it. So I think we've also got to address that as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Phil. And as I said at the start, AMR starts and ends with the patients. Lizzie, any final words from you in terms of your one thing adding to the mix in terms of how we can fix this, come up with better therapies?
Just thank you so much for everyone working in this field. I agree about the communication of this problem. Very few people seem to understand that outside of my sort of CF community, where I harp on about it all the time because it's so likely to affect us. Isaac is treated at a very large CF centre where patients are segregated by the bugs that they grow. So we have a Pseudomonas lift of our own up to the CF ward, and Isaac has never been able to meet someone with cystic fibrosis in his whole life because of cross-infection. I can't even socialise with some of the parents that I know of CF people because their child might grow a different bug to my child. There's so little understanding of how bacteria and viruses and fungi, affect people with chronic conditions. So no, just thank you to everyone working in the field, and thanks for inviting me along.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. And I think we need to learn from the CF community in terms of how to increase public awareness and spread the message in a way that makes sense. So thank you very much. And with that, thank you very much also to the rest of the panelists. This has been a great session during a very important week that hopefully will help in raising awareness, as it's intended to do, on antimicrobial resistance. And it's just been great to hear that the UK is certainly so committed and still leading in this area and having a wider international impact as well. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to all of our attendees. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hope you join some of the other events happening as AAW continues. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.